Well, good morning to all our viewers for this morning's webinar. My name is Dan Brumberg. I am a professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University, where I am advisor to the Democracy and Governance program, among other things. And I am a scholar of Middle East politics for many years. And I'm delighted to host this discussion this morning with a distinguished panel, many of whom are friends for a long time, colleagues. The title of our panel, A Renewed Iran Nuclear Deal, Prospects, Challenges, and Global and Regional Implications. My main sort of thesis this morning is, and I think everybody on the panel will probably agree, is that we're at a moment of considerable uncertainty about where these negotiations are going to. A renewed Iran nuclear deal seemed only a week or two ago on as a real prospect. After 16 months of negotiations, the U.S. and Iran appeared to be quite close to agreement to revive or resuscitate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the JCPOA, under which Iran had accepted strict limits on its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief, and from which former U.S. President Donald Trump, as we know, unilaterally withdrew in 2018, ergo getting us to where we are now. The latest rounds of negotiations, which took place last week, or this past week, saw both countries respond to a near final European Union proposal to restore the deal. It seemed that both sides were close. Iran was seeking specific concessions on the issue of assuring that the agreement would remain in effect beyond Biden's presidency, and demanding as well that the IAEA drop an ongoing investigation into suspected nuclear activities at 3 undeclared Iranian sites. Other issues that were expected at that point to obstruct the agreement had in fact apparently been resolved, and so there was great anticipation, or rising anticipation, of a deal. And if we sort of look at the transcript now and we see what we're dealing with within the last few days, the United States has responded to the Iranian proposal that was submitted to the EU, saying it's simply not acceptable. And an unnamed, I'll read this here, an unnamed US official was quoted in Politico saying, based on their answer, we appear to be moving backwards. So this is not obviously a very promising scenario, but we really don't know. The picture could change by the end of the day or within 2 hours. Who knows what's going to happen? But we need to sort of sort this out. And one way of sorting it out is to bring together a great crew of scholars and specialists who are going to help enlighten us, and we're going to sort of engage in a discussion and then open up the question and answer. I suppose that we have a number of issues on the agenda here to discuss as we proceed with the presentations. They range from the internal politics in Iran and the United States affecting the deal, which is probably certainly one consideration that's affecting the ups and downs of these talks. I would bet it's a major one. But there is, of course, the wider strategic arena. And for me personally, I suppose, or professionally, if you like, a major question is, what is the strategic meaning of a deal for the key players? So where we could imagine what it would have been some years back, but what does it mean now? What is it? Is it simply a tactical exercise, or is there any kind of strategy between animating the U.S. and Iranian approaches to having a deal at all? Maybe the absence of a deeper strategic sort of foundation for a deal helps to explain why the process is so tenuous. Perhaps all the actors really aren't quite sure if they want to be there around the table at all. Perhaps the only reason to get a deal is to avoid a major military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran. Is that sufficient to get to a deal? And of course, we are in the context of a changing regional context. We have the Abraham Accords, the evolving relationship between a number of Arab Gulf states and Israel is a remarkable development that is shifting the strategic picture. At the same time, Iran seems to be increasingly aggressive in terms of its posture in the region, and so does the United States. So the overall strategic situation does not look good, but it's not exactly clear where a deal will fit in, because if the U.S. position is to deter Iran's adventurism, as it's sometimes called in the region, does that have any impact on a relationship to a deal itself? How does the policy of deterrence affect Iran's nuclear program at all. I've written about this in the past few weeks as well. So those are just some of the many questions we'll be dealing with today, and I will now introduce the panel in the order in which they will speak. And I'll note that Trita Parsi has to leave a little early, but we will continue all the way to 12:30 when we will conclude. So Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an institution I know well and contribute to regularly, and he is a long-term speaker, analyst, writer, academic on events in the Middle East, Iran's foreign policy, Iranian-Israeli relations. His work goes back a long way. Assal Rad is the research director at the National Iranian Council, and she will discuss public opinion of the deal, internal Iranian political considerations, which are a major issue, and U.S. diplomacy and Israeli pressure. That's a lot to have under a presentation. 12 minutes max for everybody. Kristian Coates Ulrichsen is a non-resident senior fellow at Arab Center in D.C., a good place to be, and at the Baker Institute, is also a Baker Institute fellow for the Middle East at Rice University, where I've been many times. And last but not least, Barbara Slavin is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. So I've just basically introduced our panelists without saying much about what they're going to focus on, but we'll just take it one at a time and their focus will become clear as we move along. So Trita, I'm going to pass the mic to you because I know we need to get going. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. Obviously, I think most of us had wished that there would have been more positive news to talk about by now. And that has been true for the last 16 months, I would say. But here we are, same pattern as before. What I want to talk about is, let's imagine that the deal actually is struck. What does it mean? Go to some of Dan's questions. Is it tactical? Is it strategic? And can it last, given everything that has happened? I am unfortunately not particularly optimistic. I think there's chances, there's things that can be done. But let me explain why I think this is a more fragile deal than it was in 2015. First of all, the issue of trust and lack of it has been haunting US-Iran relations for more than 4 decades. And it's probably never been as bad, or at least it's as bad now as it has been in some of the worst episodes in US-Iran history. There's a couple of facts that I think are noteworthy. First of all, there were some mismatched expectations. The Iranians expected that after 3 years of sticking to the deal, even though the US had left, 2 of those years, or 1 of those years was with the full Iranian compliance. The last 2, the Iranians had reduced their obligations, violated some terms of it, but nevertheless, they were in the deal. The expectation very clearly on the Iranian side was that the United States would quickly come back into the deal, whether it was through an executive order or some other measures. Instead, the Biden administration spent the first 3 or so months of its presidency consulting with the 3 countries that had opposed the deal and who had pushed the Trump administration to get out of the deal: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. What that did to confidence on the Iranian side is really difficult to overstate. It essentially left them with the impression that Biden actually was going to pursue somewhat of a similar policy as Trump. He was going to use Trump's sanctions as leverage to be able to get a longer and stronger deal. In fact, some of the communication to the Iranians by the US had been that the US will come in if the Iranians guarantee that they will immediately move towards a negotiation to make the deal longer and stronger. All of this created a massive amount of mistrust. The Iranians then responded by further expanding their nuclear program, as they had done under the Trump years, but now they went even further. I mean, there was no 60% enriched uranium under the Trump administration, but there's now more than 44 kilos of 60% enriched uranium, all of which would started about 3 or 4 months into Biden's presidency. You can imagine what that did to feelings of trust on the American side. So by the time they started negotiating in April 2021, the atmosphere was already poisoned. What then made matters even worse is that the Iranians refused to directly talk to the United States. When you take a look at how, even before getting a deal, during the 2013 to 2015 negotiations, you could see steadily how confidence and trust was starting to slowly but surely be built between the United States and Iran. It was largely because the Iranians and the Americans were talking to each other directly. Kerry spent more times with Zarif than with any other foreign minister. They kept on testing each other. They kept on passing those tests. And each time the confidence built up, even though the deal had not yet even been struck. Now, all of this was done through intermediaries, and the Europeans have played, or the EEAS has played a heroic role in all of this, but it's next to impossible to build trust when there isn't any face time between the two sides. And then, perhaps most importantly, there is a major flaw in the deal, which is that the deal does not address the likelihood or the consequences of the US withdrawing from the deal. The snapback sanctions were invented for the JCPOA, which would deal with what if the Iranians were to cheat. No such mechanism was put in place in the original JCPOA for an American withdrawal, and it turned out that it was the American withdrawal that was apparently more likely than an Iranian withdrawal. That is still not addressed in the current deal. So now it's no longer a speculation. There's clear-cut experience of the US withdrawing. There are at least 3 or 4 major Republican figures, top contenders for the presidency if the Republicans win the elections in 2024, who have already declared they will walk out of this deal. And the current arrangement really does not address this. So the reasons, the objective reasons for either side to feel more comfortable of the longevity of the deal are simply not there this time around. Add to that a changing geopolitical picture that has changed, or at least amended, the desires and the interests of the two sides. I think, Dan, you put your finger on it. If this is just tactical and there's no strategic element, is that potentially explaining why there's such hesitation around it? And I think you have a point there. Zarif famously said that the JCPOA would be the floor, not the ceiling. And there were clear evidence that on both sides, there was an interest to build on the JCPOA. Perhaps they didn't have the same time frame in mind. Perhaps they wanted things to work first before they could move on, but there was an interest on both sides. There is no indication that there is much of an interest on either Washington or Tehran's side to move much beyond this. In fact, part of the reason why the Biden administration did not do any of the confidence building measures that the Obama administration did before they began negotiations was precisely because they wanted to avoid any perception in some Arab states and in Israel that the JCPOA was a stepping stone towards something bigger. They wanted to indicate that that wasn't the case. And if there wasn't much interest in Biden's White House for a broader opening with Iran under Rouhani, rest assured it's very difficult to imagine that there would be greater interest now when Raisi is in power. Same thing exists on the Iranian side. The Iranians have been waiting for decades for the world to turn multipolar so that the US is no longer calling all the shots. That moment seemed to have arrived now. At least that's the way the Iranians are seeing it. The Iranians are now seeing that the Chinese and the Russians are much more willing than they were before because of their own rising tensions with the United States to protect Iran or collaborate or coordinate matters with Iran. As you all recall, Russia and China both voted for Iran's file to be shifted to the Security Council back in 2006. Those days seem to be past. And the Iranians are looking across the Persian Gulf and they're seeing that America's friends do not find the United States to be reliable. They're hedging their bets by moving closer to China. So if America's friends are doing so, why should Iran, still an enemy of the United States, feel that it's worthwhile to move closer to the United States geopolitically? And I think would also add to this that you have on the American side a perspective that China is the name of the game in all of this. That's the focus of this century. And part of the way that has impacted US policy in the Middle East is a belief that one of the US's strongest cards in the competition with China is its alliance system. Retaining those allies at almost any cost seems to be the priority of the Biden administration. Hence, this appeasement of MBS, which so far has not given any positive results. But the calculation seems to be it's easier to retain your friends than to take a risky gambit and try to win new friends and trying to pull the Iranians away from Russia and China. So there's no interest in doing something with Iran that could undermine relations with some of the GCC states, and certainly no optimism that the United States would be able to pull Iran to its side. So on that count as well, the status quo seems to be more preferred by both sides than anything that would use the JCPOA as a strategic linchpin for something bigger than that. All of this, in my view, leads to a situation in which both sides expect the deal to not last much longer than 2 years. And the path of least resistance, political least resistance on both sides, is to then use the next 2 years to prepare for the showdown in 2025, rather than do something to strengthen the deal or strengthen its longevity. On the American side, it means to build up a stronger and more credible military option. On the Iranian side, they're going to be using the next 2 years, most likely, to insulate their economy from sanctions, or as they say it, neutralize sanctions, meaning that the sanctions that will come in 2025, as they expected, will not have that much of an impact on their economy. There are ways, however, that they could use the next 2 years to turn this on its head, to make sure that the longevity of the JCPOA actually is stronger, and that there won't be a second American exit or Iranian exit from the deal. Some of them are not, in my view, they're no-brainers. They're not particularly complex, but they are nevertheless politically quite challenging. One is, if there is a deal, there is going to be a direct US-Iran conversation through the commission, but it's going to be limited to the JCPOA. That should not be the case. It would benefit both sides to institutionalize their dialogue, making sure that it's at the state Secretary of State and Foreign Ministry level, the National Security Advisor level, and do it in such a way that it's not personalized. And as a result, the political cost for future administrations in the US or Iranian government will be much lower to just continue what already has been established. I found it interesting that 2019, an Iranian official told me that they believe that had they actually engaged Trump in 2017, he might not have pulled out of the deal. I think there is a likelihood that that actually could have been true. And precisely for that reason, it would be a mistake not to use the next 2 years to engage way beyond than just the JCPOA. The issue of assurances is critical, but there's a few things the United States can do alone that would rest that issue. But I think if you actually allow the deal to become a bit bigger, which certainly is the desire on the American side, not a grand bargain, then there's some opportunities that open up. The US wants some of the restrictions to be longer. Could the US perhaps put primary sanctions on the table in order to achieve that objective? If you have American sanctions on American companies lifted, and there actually is direct US-Iran trade, it's not a guarantee that the US will not pull out of the deal, but it will be one other layer of resistance, another layer of political cost for a future American president to pull out of the deal and by that punish American companies. Moreover, the Europeans can play a critical role, as they already have. They need to redesign their energy security policy. They're shifting away from Russia for the long term. This is not a tactical move. Could Iranian gas play a role in Europe's longer term gas strategy and energy strategy? If so, it would then further add a layer of resistance to anything that would break the JCPOA. And finally, I would say this, on the regional level, the picture is different. As Dan pointed out, there are other alliances or groupings that seem to be taking place, but there's also another difference. Back in 2015, the UAE and Saudi Arabia were strongly opposed to the deal. Today, it appears to me, I think Kristian would know better, I think the Saudis are still there pretty opposed to it. But the UAE seems to have kind of figured out that if there is a military confrontation, it will be on the front line of it. It may not want to see a love fest between the United States and Iran, but it definitely wants to pull itself out of the front line of any potential US-Iran confrontation. Moreover, Oman and Qatar are playing a rather critical role in trying to ensure that the deal actually is struck. If you have regional integration taking place, greater trade and political integration, which did not take place after 2015, that too can add another layer that will create some degree of resistance for another reckless American exit from the deal. Thank you so much.
Great, Trita. Thanks very much. You really framed things, I think, extremely well. I do wonder whether Iran, in terms of its relationship with Russia and China, will see its interest in helping Europe out. That's a matter of some debate and discussion, I think, but I think you put your finger on a lot of the key issues. And I would like to turn now to Assal and really let's move from this sort of this, first of all, this wider strategic and regional and global view that we got from Trita and ponder the question in part. And Assal, if you could take this as part of your mission here, as to sort of what the internal debate looks like in Iran, because it seems from my perspective that the so-called hardliners, which are by no means a monolithic group, it's a term that doesn't get us very far, but in any case, terms have their limitations. The so-called hardliners are really putting a great deal of pressure on the government to sort of resist a deal. I wonder in the end whether, even if there is a deal, this 2-year scenario that Trita mentioned reminds us that, in fact, what will a deal get us, if not just a waiting period, a holding period. But in any case, Assal, if you could take the mic and pursue the discussion for the next 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you very much.
Sure, and thank you for having me. You know, when you look at the internal dynamics in Iran, there's two aspects of it, right? There's the Iranian people, and then there's the Iranian government. There's the officials who are in power, and neither side of that equation is a monolith, right? There's diverse opinions on both sides. But when you talk about resistance from the Iranian side, you know, we talk about hawks in Washington. So their mirror images are hardliners in Iran. You always had people in Iran in the officials that were against the deal. And so they, just like the hawks that you have in the US, have acted to undermine that deal in some ways, especially because they didn't want to give moderates or reformist views in the country any kind of credence or achievements. And so the internal dynamics, if you're looking at the political calculations, the internal dynamics will be based on who is in power to a certain extent, right? Whoever is in power want to please their own base, just like you would see in the case of the United States. The Raisi administration has still shown that they are open to the deal because under the politics of the Iranian government, it wouldn't be something that there's no presidential administration that could pursue something like this unless the supreme leadership and the more powerful branches of the Iranian government actually would agree to it anyways. So there is a large consensus to the deal, but under what circumstances? This idea of resisting US pressure is especially aligned with the hardliners, which is why, you know, there was this opportunity when the Biden administration first came in, while the Rouhani administration was still in power, to capitalize on the fact that that administration really wanted engagement with the West. That's what they ran their elections on. That's what they were elected to do, versus the Raisi administration. So the internal calculations change based on who's in power, but also based on what's happening outside, right? Whatever the US actions actually impact those calculations as well. And so the fact that the US was the party that quit the deal, the fact that they can use that sort of rhetoric, what the hardline rhetoric has long been, which is that the US can't be trusted, much like in the US, you hear that Iran can't be trusted. We have the reverse sort of framing when discussing the United States. And so it lent itself, quitting the deal, withdrawing from it, reimposing sanctions. The fact that sanctions weren't lifted or eased at all within a global pandemic, right? All of these things, all of these actions on the part of the United States lent itself to the hardline rhetoric that said, look, the US can't be trusted. And so you get this sense of resistance rhetoric continuing from the Iranian side. That being said, and Trita talked about this a little bit, the Raisi administration is different than its predecessor because it's pivoting away from this idea of engagement with the West. It's turning not just to China and Russia, and those dynamics are themselves built into US geopolitical dynamics, right? This sort of creation of the US on one side with its alliances versus China as an enemy, Russia as an enemy, Iran as an enemy. Well, those enemies tend to then gravitate towards each other when that is the stance that the US takes itself. There is also the pivot towards the region itself, and that has been an emphasis of the Raisi administration to amend ties with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and you're seeing progress actually on that front as this administration focuses more on the region itself and less on engagement with the West. There, in terms of the Iranian populace, one thing to keep in mind is when we talk about internal Iranian calculations, when we talk about the nuclear deal itself, One of the things that we always hear is about breakout time, right? Breakout time is sort of the measure that was used to decide that this is how long it would take Iran to have enough nuclear material to build a weapon. It's not the amount of time it would take Iran to build a weapon. That's something important to distinguish, right? Because even if Iran has enough nuclear material to do so, it would still take 1 to 2 years for it to actually have a capable weapon. But all of that is contingent upon a political decision by Iran, right? Iran has to make the decision to weaponize. It's not just having the material. You have to actually decide that this is the path that you want to go down. And while the Iranian population has long, in polling at least, has shown that they're against a nuclear weapon, they're not against their peaceful nuclear program. They're not against a civilian nuclear program. In fact, there's overwhelming support for a civilian nuclear program. And it's because it's a show of national independence, right? The fact that Iran is independent from foreign pressure and is allowed to pursue technologies that benefit its people in that country. And so what you've seen in this period is a little bit of a shift in thinking where even people who were reformist minded and moderate minded and were against nuclear weapons have started to think that maybe it would actually benefit them to have nuclear weapons. This is not a decision that's been made politically, but you can see the calculations, the potential for the calculations to shift. Now, the sad irony of that is that thought, this line of reasoning is coming in reaction to US actions, right? Because the deal did not reap any benefits for the Iranian side. You see these calculations changing. And in fact, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fact that the US has not engaged yet directly with Russia, in part because of the fear of nuclear escalation, starts to create these types of calculations. Well, maybe it makes more sense to have a nuclear weapon because that creates greater deterrence. So those are the things that we should be watching for, but always keeping in mind that these calculations are not in a vacuum. While Iran is depicted as this very ideological sort of fanatic state, in fact, their political actions are much more shrewd, they're much more calculated. And we heard all of this back in 2014 and 2015. Iran can't be trusted, Iran won't negotiate with the US. All of that has been proven to be untrue. We know that as a fact now. And that's something to always keep in mind. It's rare that you have a policy situation where you get to see what it's like to have the policy and you get to see what it's like to not have the policy. And we know that in this case. So we know that when someone says Iran can't be trusted, well, we know Iran abided by the deal. Not only did Iran abide by the deal, it abided by the deal in full, as Trita said, for a full year after the US actually violated and quit the deal. Now, how does this lend itself to, we talked about a little bit the idea of internal dynamics and decision-making, but what are the internal dynamics in terms of the Iranian populace, Iranian popular opinion about the deal? Well, back in 2015, it was overwhelmingly popular. How do we know that? Well, you can go back to simply scenes of both in April and in July of 2015, when the framework of the deal was announced. You saw Iranians flooding the streets celebrating. When the deal itself was announced in July of 2015, again, to the streets Iranians go to celebrate this deal, because in part, I mean, the largest aspect of it is the economic relief. I talked about the fact that the political calculations change based on who's in power because they are trying to appease their own camps, their own bases. But there is one factor that every administration, every successive administration, and this is everywhere in the world, right, has to consider. That's the economy. Economic factors. I mean, successive Iranian administrations have promised economic relief for Iranian people. None of them have delivered on that. Part of the deal, I mean, the crux of the deal for the Iranian side was economic relief. That is what they were expecting to get. And so part of those celebrations on the Iranian side, on the Iranian people, was that they would finally have some form of economic relief from sanctions, which have really hit the middle class. Obviously, you can imagine how much they've hurt lower class, poor sectors, working class sectors within the country as well. So it's not surprising to note that support for the deal within Iran has waned over the years. It's not surprising because their opinions of the deal are based on the context of how the deal benefits them. If they see no benefit from the deal, then clearly opinions will start to decline. And that's the trajectory that we've seen since 2015 up until now. Beyond just the celebrations that we saw, there's The University of Maryland has done polling in Iran for years, which have looked at this trajectory in terms of polling. While we had overwhelming support in 2014 and 15, that has, according to the polls, clearly declined over these years. If we want to look at another factor to tell us what is Iranian public opinion on it, sometimes polling, and especially in an authoritarian country like Iran, polling can't be, there's always some margin of error. Well, we can look at the elections of 2013 and 2017. Iranians voted, unlike this last election, voted in large numbers in 2013. And in fact, in 2017, when they re-elected the Rouhani administration, 70%, you saw a 70% turnout of voters, which is a huge turnout. That shows again that there was support among the population to maintain this deal in hopes of not just the economic relief, but really opening Iran as a country, opening it to the West, engaging with the West. And part of it plays into the ideology of the Islamic Republic, right? This idea that they have an anti-US stance, that on the international stage, they're sort of isolated. Iranians wanted to come out of that isolation. They themselves, Iranian people, want to engage with the West because they want to engage with everybody. They want to have relations with everywhere in the world. They want their country to be more open, and they want to be able to be a part of, to be on the international stage as well with every other country in the world. So you see this support that declines over the last, from 2015 to 2022. At the beginning of the Biden administration, another key factor that you see on the Iranian side, and again, this is among the population, this is Iranian people who are being polled and are saying that it should be the US, this was back in early 2021, it should be the US that takes the first steps. This is, again, all of this is fairly intuitive. If we just look at the situation that we were handed, you have a deal that, sort of in the international community, the fear, as Trita pointed out, why there's this imbalance in accountability is because there was constantly the idea that Iran is going to violate the deal. No one had calculated for the fact that, well, what if the US, what if another party actually is the one that violates the deal? What are the consequences of that? And because it was the US that quit the deal, because it was the US that reimposed sanctions, and on top of that, the Trump administration used very aggressive rhetoric, right? Very aggressive language in the way they talked about Iran. All of this played into sort of the national sentiments of the Iranian population, and they really see it as a mistake that the US made, and therefore the US has to fix. That was the view going into the beginning of the Biden administration. The most recent polls that we have from August of this year, so just from last month, show that unfortunately, a majority of Iranians actually don't think that the US will even uphold its end of the deal. This is based on, again, the precedents, the experiences that they've had over the last several years. And you can even talk about the Biden administration, because there was an expectation, as Trita pointed out, there was an expectation that this administration would act quickly to return to and restore the deal. Now there's this sort of consistency, a continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, especially in terms of how the daily lives of Iranians are impacted by sanctions. And that impact has continued between these administrations. So their experience has been the same experience. So the most recent polls say that despite that fact, despite the sort of, negative view that they might have about US guarantees and the fact that the US would uphold its end of the deal, a majority still believe that restoring the deal is beneficial to the economy. And that is the key factor. The key factor is the idea that the Iranian economy has been battered by sanctions, and Iranians know that they need and desire relief from sanctions. I mean, just hyperinflation on its own. We look in the US at the idea, we look at numbers like 8 or 9% inflation and think, and look at the reaction that you're seeing amongst the US populace based on that number when we're looking at inflation, how much harder it is for working class Americans to afford, just the essential goods. Now imagine there are goods in Iran that face upwards of 300% inflation. These are the numbers that we're seeing. So in terms of how it is impacting, how sanctions are impacting the Iranian economy, they're not hurting the state, they're not hurting the officials that are in power, they're impacting ordinary Iranians. And that's why the opinions of ordinary Iranians of the deal are based on how the deal is affecting them. Arguably, the deal, right? The fact that Iran engaged with the West, abided by the deal, agreed to this, signed this agreement, they've actually been punished for it. They're worse off now than they have been in any other period since the revolution in terms of the amount and impact of sanctions that are on Iran. And so when you look at it from that perspective, when you look at it from their internal perspective, you really have to consider why the actions of the Biden administration or any US admin is so important, and why looking for just accountability being placed into the deal is so important for that side internally. The last thing I wanted to touch on was, and this all plays into it, right, is US diplomacy and Israeli pressure. What will affect that calculus, what will affect both public opinion and internal political calculations in Iran, are US actions, right? If we have good faith diplomacy, if there's some good faith gesture or effort to show that this admin is serious about wanting to restore the deal, then that goes back to the idea of trust that we were talking about earlier. Trust is so important, and that trust is completely gone. In order to restore it, and this is, again, like a sort of basic intuitive human interaction in psychology, is when one side has taken that trust away, has taken an action that breaks trust, they also have to take an action to fix that, to amend that. There is always the opportunity to de-escalate, but that becomes more challenging the more entrenched we become in tensions. I mean, you saw earlier this week, US B-52s flying over the region as a show of force. This is the language that is used in framing why you see the flights of B-52s. This has happened multiple times under this particular admin. A show of force is not necessarily the context in which you think good diplomacy is happening. And while there are certainly steps that the Iranian side can take, and this is not, the onus is not only on the US to take certain actions, but also on the Iranian side. If this conversation was taking place in Tehran, we would be talking about that. But this conversation is taking place here. And that's why we focus on what the US side can do in order to get there. The last thing I will mention, just in terms of Israeli pressure, is Israel, like Iran, like the US, is not a monolith. While you have, rhetorically, you have Israeli politicians who are against the deal, actions taken by the Israeli government to sabotage and undermine the deal, there are also sectors within the Israeli populace and its defense and security establishments that have come out saying, not only supporting the deal, but saying that it was a huge mistake on the US side to leave the deal. So what we need to see more is trust being built by the US, and listening to the voices of, sort of peaceful diplomacy that even exist within Israel. We focus on this fact that Israel wants to sabotage and undermine the deal, which is true to a certain extent, but there are voices within that state that also support the deal. And so I think those are the voices that we should be, that Washington should be listening to in order to be able to restore this deal. And I'll leave it at that so that we can move on.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to make sure that we leave enough time, since Trita has to leave a little early. So this puts a little pressure on our two remaining speakers to be as succinct as possible. And each of you have a subject that is worthy of an entire conference. I know that. Kristian, if you could sort of unpack sort of the Arab Gulf situation for us and give us a sense of what the sort of dynamics there are, and particularly the sort of internal tensions within the Gulf and how they're affecting the negotiations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I think when Biden took office in January 2021, the assumption in Gulf capitals was that the administration would go back into the deal. And so the focus in Gulf capitals, and again, there's not a single Arab Gulf position on this, there has never been one, and I suspect there never will be one. But the focus in Arab Gulf capitals at the beginning of the administration was on whether any re-entry into the deal would be followed by a sort of follow-on negotiation to address the issues that Arab Gulf states say that are issues of their concern, which are, in their view, Iran's regional actions around the Gulf. And so I think that was the main area of focus for leaders, especially in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, to some extent, perhaps in other countries, especially Bahrain as well. Over time, I think it's become clear to people in the Gulf as it has to everyone else, including on this panel, that the fact that there wouldn't be a rapid re-entry into the deal means that people are now looking at it through different lenses. And of course, people in the Gulf are now looking at it through the lens of US domestic politics, through the midterm elections coming up, and then beginning to project ahead to 2024 and what may lie beyond, as other speakers have said. So I think the mood in the Arab Gulf has shifted away from assuming that the deal would be done and that there would or would not necessarily be a focus on other issues, to now thinking about what this means if there's no deal, if there's just a continuation of the state of limbo where effectively the can is kicked down the road time and time again. What does it mean to just have this sort of state of kind of deal, no deal, continuing at least for months more? Trita had mentioned about the hedging of US partners and allies, and I think this is as true in the Gulf as it is of anyone else. What we have seen is over the last couple of years, but it's also the last couple of weeks as well, with the UAE and Kuwait both sending ambassadors back to Iran after the sort of partial cut in ties in 2016. We're seeing Gulf countries also beginning to make their own arrangements and their own accommodations. And to some extent, this is part of a longer term pattern. And again, Trita had mentioned the UAE's concern about the UAE being caught in the middle of a potential conflict. And I think that's a very real concern. I think in January 2020, when Qasem Soleimani was killed, it was remarkable that both the UAE and Saudi Arabia had called specifically for a kind of a de-escalation. The Saudi Deputy Defense Minister, MBS's brother, Prince Khalid, went to Washington to make the case that this wasn't a time for another war. The UAE, I think, realized that a missile strike on the UAE, on Dubai or Abu Dhabi could do incredible damage to their, well, just to the sort of entire narrative of the UAE as a safe place to live, work, and do business in an otherwise volatile part of the world. And we saw Houthi attacks on the UAE at the beginning of this year, how quickly that could be potentially undermined. So for different reasons, the Gulf countries are beginning to make their own arrangements. Saudi Arabia has obviously had 5 or 6 rounds of negotiations with Iranian officials, which may or may not be going well, which is hard to tell. But they're clearly, I think, also focusing on trying to get to some sort of arrangement in Yemen that will allow the Saudis to at least withdraw without looking like a complete operational, military, and strategic setback. We're seeing the UAE, again, reach out to Iran directly. And I think a lot of that relates back to something Donald Trump did in 2019, which was perhaps unintended from Trump, didn't think about the consequences, but was very much not responding to the attacks on energy and maritime facilities in Saudi Arabia and the UAE between May and September, culminating in the September 2019 strike on Abqaiq, which has never been formally attributed to any one actor, but which I think many in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf assume was linked somehow to the maximum pressure campaign and then the maximum response. And I mean, that I think was the game changer in the Gulf. I think that lack of US response, not only that, but Trump actually went out of his way 2 days later to say this was an attack on Saudi Arabia. It wasn't an attack on the US. It was quite remarkable in the sense that it punctured the assumption in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh that, especially when it came to anything to do with Iran or Iran's regional activities, that their interests and US interests were one and the same. And Trump effectively signaled that that wasn't necessarily the case. And so we almost immediately began to see the beginnings of Saudi Arabia and the UAE beginning to rethink those policies, to at least establish channels of communication, channels of dialogue, and to also row back from that kind of hardline rhetoric that we'd seen from, say, 2015 when the Saudis and the UAE went into Yemen, up until about 2018, when Mohammed bin Salman, for example, said that if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, we'll get one too. There were some comments about making sure that any fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran would take place in Iran, not in Saudi Arabia. And we saw a very strong sort of dialing back of some of those, at least rhetorical flourishes. And I think that has persisted into the Biden administration and is continuing regardless of whether we see a deal or not. We see Gulf Arab countries now making their own sets of accommodations and arrangements just to make sure that they project their own interests, regardless of what happens in a negotiation to which, after all, they are not parties. They can perhaps try and make their interests known, but they are not ultimately involved in the negotiations in Vienna. So what has changed from 2015? I would argue that the sort of sense of rapprochement, or perhaps a more realistic sense of Saudi UAE vulnerabilities, perhaps a sense of being more on their own without necessarily being able to rely on the US to come to their support. That's one difference in 2015. And I guess the other difference, of course, is the Abraham Accords, normalization with Israel in terms of, at least for Bahrain, for the UAE, and certainly the UAE has gone a lot further than the other three countries which normalized in 2020, although Jared Kushner, I think it's 5 or 6. But the UAE has gone a lot further in actually kind of operationalizing the Abraham Accords. And actually the text of the Abraham Accord that was signed with the UAE contained a specific section entitled a strategic agenda for the Middle East. I think we're beginning to see some of that come to fruition with, for example, greater cooperation between Arab Gulf and Israeli components under a US umbrella. So, I mean, that's also the second difference in 2015. Having said that, I think it's become very clear that the UAE, regardless of normalization with Israel, through sending its ambassador back to Iran, through signaling that they're not in favor of a military confrontation, I think they're trying to walk a tight walk a tightrope and kind of balance the very different and competing issues that they face, pressures that they face. And then just very briefly for the other Gulf countries, we continue to see Oman and Qatar at least try to provide their offices, at least for ensuring that channels of communication remain open. We've obviously had the passing, again, since 2015, of Sultan Qaboos and of Emir Sabah in Kuwait, who are the two sort of great sort of diplomats in the Gulf with decades of experience in regional diplomacy, where, especially in Kuwait, I think there's a kind of leadership concern about the age and health of the rulers. So we're seeing Oman and Qatar, and I think especially right now that Qatar is trying to take the lead in at least ensuring that whatever happens with the negotiations, that there's not a kind of an escalation that then obviously puts the Gulf countries in the front line, given the likelihood of any potential escalation that could, well, involve them, but not at their own asking. So I think that's where we stand. I know we're a bit pressed for time, so I'm happy to answer any other questions in the Q&A. But yeah, I'll pass back to you. Thanks, Dan.
Great, and I'm sure that many questions will come up for Kristian, and very important issues. I mean, the story of the region seems to be a perception of U.S. disinterest, decline in power, and then Biden is trying to sort of turn that upside down by putting the U.S. front and center. We want to get back to that. So interesting dynamic when we have our discussion. Barbara, you are our last speaker, and then we'll hear from you, and then we'll still have plenty of time for everybody to elaborate their ideas in the question and answer period. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Arab Center. I'm in a terrible position following all these great presentations. So let me just pick up a few threads. I think domestic politics in the United States is a very important factor. Even though the nuclear agreement is more popular now, according to the opinion polls, than it was back in 2015. We have gotten to a point where we are on the cusp of midterm elections. And I think that is one of the problems that we're facing now. Had the talks made more progress sooner, there would have been time for the Biden administration to submit the agreement to congressional scrutiny well before the midterms. But we're already getting past that margin now. Our elections are on November the 8th, and under INARA, which is the legislation that governs this nuclear deal and what Congress gets to do and not do, the administration is obliged to give Congress 30 days to take action, debate it, pass a resolution of approval, of disapproval, whatever. And so we are really getting close to being out of time for that to happen before midterm elections. So it appears that the intention is to kick this can down the road past, I should also mention, Israeli elections, which I believe are in November, a week before ours, November the 1st. And then ours, of course, are November the 8th, to kick this can down the road past those elections. We will then have a lame duck Congress in which Democrats retain a majority. And so if there is a deal for them to consider, the likelihood of any kind of congressional action or interference is quite small. Even if Republicans win in November, they don't take over, say, the House of Representatives until next January. So that is one possibility. I think my colleagues have all talked about the hesitancy on the Iranian side about returning to an agreement that the US violated so egregiously in 2018. But I still think there is a case to be made for it, although the longer we go on, the less value, frankly, there is for Iran in terms of the sanctions relief, especially if they have to worry about what happens in 2025 in the United States. Nevertheless, oil prices are high, and Iran is in a position to double, more than double, its oil exports should it go back into the deal. And that's a lot of hard currency, which the Iranian economy really, really needs. So it might still have value for them, even if we do kick this down the road. We haven't talked about the IAEA at all, and I think it's important to raise this issue because in June, basically, the European Union had a draft which the United States was satisfied with. And it's the Iranians who have been kind of dragging their feet and trying to get, in addition to lifting of the nuclear-related sanctions, a promise by the International Atomic Energy Agency to close its investigation into these traces of uranium that were found in 3 places that Iran never declared to the IAEA. And they've been trying to, to resolve this somehow without ever admitting that they did anything wrong. What's been particularly frustrating for the American and European negotiators is that it seemed a couple of weeks ago that Iran had agreed to kind of put this aside, not make it a precondition for coming back into compliance with the JCPOA. And then lo and behold, a week ago, they raised it again. And now they're once again demanding that this issue be resolved by a date certain. And if it's not resolved by a date certain, then they won't implement their promises to come back into compliance with the JCPOA. So this suggests, that their negotiating tactics can be extremely counterproductive, certainly in terms of how the United States feels about it. And I think it's fair to say that American negotiators are very frustrated and are at a point where they're basically saying, well, if you don't want it, we don't want it. Of course, we all know that the danger is you can't just kick things down the road in the Middle East. Things have a way of happening. You mentioned the B-52s and the show of force. Assal, well, we also must remember that Biden promised when he was in Israel that he would use force as a last resort to prevent Iran from developing weapons. There's been a lot of hawkish commentary, particularly from the Republicans in Congress and Republican presidential candidates, but also from some Democrats. We've had a number of very disturbing incidents regarding Iran, terrorist plots against dissidents in various places, and the awful attack on Salman Rushdie, which was traced back to the fatwa that was issued by Ayatollah Khomeini so many years ago. So Iran is not exactly in good odor in the United States on either side of the political aisle. And in this atmosphere, you can see that the Biden administration is in no rush to be making new concessions. I don't think there will be any. So we have to hope that we can get through the next couple of months without some sort of clash. We have incidents going on in Syria. We have incredible instability in Iraq, which is very concerning to both the United States and Iran. We have a fragile truce in Yemen that could come unstuck at any time with more attacks on the Saudis or others. So, you know, it's a dangerous limbo to be in, but it is what it is. And I think that I agree with Trita that if we are lucky enough to get this back, it will not be, you know, we will not be feeling any sense of euphoria. We will be feeling rather a sense of relief that the nuclear file has been temporarily stabilized, but we'll have all the other concerns that we have with Iran. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible domestic repression that is going on in Iran. Filmmakers, teachers, bus drivers, lawyers, women with loose hijab, all being locked up by a regime that is not popular and that does not, frankly, seem to care very much about the Iranian people, but more about its own self-preservation and perpetuation. So this is a scary time, folks. And why don't I leave it there so that there will be time for Trita to answer one question before he disappears.
Right. And I thank you very much. Barbara really, frames things in a way that's very sobering and brings us right down to some of the nitty gritty. I mean, the Iranian response of the government to the Salman Rushdie attack was disgusting. I mean, it was atrocious. I mean, basically he had it coming. But it also sort of raises a bigger issue, and that is sort of, ultimately who's in charge and what's the ideological perspective of the Islamic Republic. I mean, I'm one who doesn't see the domestic situations in the U.S. and Iran as quite equal. The American Constitution doesn't mention Iran at all. So there are sort of many constraints in Iran that I think have deep roots in the nature of the Islamic Republic, and I've written about that extensively. And I think they manifest themselves in the negotiations, in the Rushdie response, in the hardliners. And yes, do they care about public opinion? Self-preservation. Well, that's the name of the game in any regime, isn't it? So there's a lot to talk about. Here, Trita, question for you from a mutual colleague. Obama purposely did not designate the JCPOA as a treaty because he couldn't get it through the Senate. He knew he couldn't get the 2/3. How can Biden give the Iranians an assurance that the next U.S. president would adhere to the deal when it would again be an executive agreement? I think that's that's an important question. And then if you want to sort of tackle the issues that Barbara raised in terms of the IAEA report and its concerns, because the Iranian response to that has been erratic, and many folks would argue that it has not been helpful. So two big issues, too little time.
Thank you. On the first issue, yes, obviously it would be better to have a treaty, but I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that a treaty actually is sufficiently stable in and of itself. There actually was a treaty between the United States and Iran, the 1955 Amity Treaty, and Mike Pompeo ripped it apart, and it hardly made any news. And it was a treaty. It was ratified by the Senate. I'm not saying it was very important, but bottom line is the idea that if the United States just signs a treaty, it will in and of itself be sufficient, is not entirely true, because at the end of the day, it's the degree of political support for the agreement that is determinative here. And a treaty is a way of signaling that it does have it, but in and of itself is not sufficient. I think there needs to be a series of different measures that helps change the domestic political discourse on this issue in the United States. And of course, it's needed in Iran as well. But if we focus now on the US, we are faced with a problem in which for Republicans, I would argue that the JCPOA essentially has become an identity issue. If you're a Republican, you are pro-guns, anti-abortion, and anti-JCPOA. There's not much conversation about it. That's essentially where you are. And as long as that is the case, treaty or no treaty, I don't think it makes a difference. I think trade can potentially open this up. I wrote a piece earlier last year or so, imagining what the trade would look like if primary sanctions were lifted. And a very big portion of that trade would actually be Iran buying agricultural goods from the United States. Corn, for instance, is a very, very big Iranian import. Where is corn in the United States grown? It's overwhelmingly grown in red districts. Even in the state of Illinois, which is the biggest corn producer of the United States, the corn is grown in the red districts within that blue state. if that could change the perspective of 15 to 20 members of Congress from the Republican Party, that could potentially be enough to break this type of partisan hold that this issue is having, which is ensuring that there's hardly any reasonable conversation about the actual merits of the agreement. It's become entirely political. On the issue of the IAEA, I agree. I think this is one of those cases that shows that when the Iranians are retaliating, in their view, against American measures, well, it does have a way of ricocheting back to them, because much of what this would be about is not just what happened in pre-2003, it's also what happened during the past months in which the Iranians have turned off the cameras. Those may not be as problematic as what happened 20 or so years ago, but it nevertheless adds a dimension. And that dimension is, last time around, there was no demand that the IAEA had to come to an agreement with Iran. But it was structured in such a way that unless it did, much of the other measures would not proceed. But that was because neither side thought that they were on the same type of a time pressure that they're on right now. And that is, again, because they don't believe this is likely to survive beyond 2025. I don't see any other way for the Iranians to actually answer the IAEA's questions. And the sooner they do so, the better. But I think we also do have to recognize, when a country has been screwed over, as it was by the JCPOA, it is not entirely irrational for it to get paranoid. Its paranoia has been vindicated. And you don't undo that paranoia by just telling them, you're paranoid, get over it. They have a reason to be paranoid. So there needs to be some confidence building measure. But then again the Iranians have themselves not been terribly helpful, because there's not been any agreement on their end to talk directly to the United States.
We have a number of questions here that have been emailed to us, and one is, I'll read it, but then I'm going to add just a sort of little remark to it, expand it. Why is everyone concerned by Iran developing uranium weapons which are not technically or strategically viable and are not used in ballistic missiles? I'm not sure that everybody would agree with that, but such a weapon would be practically unusable by Iran. But there does seem to be a broader sort of question that was raised earlier on in the discussion, and that is, and Assal, I think, also touched on it, and that is between making enough enriched uranium for one so-called bomb and having a program that has effective deterrence. There's a long way down the road between getting from that point to an actual nuclear capacity that provides Iran with security. In fact, one might argue that the very effort to sort of just create one bomb makes the situation much more precarious and really raises the stakes for an attack by Israel on Iran itself. So, but I said a broader question behind the question I just read is sort of where is the strategic value? And Barbara, you can maybe comment on this, in Iran pursuing not a weapon, because we're not sort of in Dr. Strangelove sort of territory where we talk about one weapon, because many experts would say that one weapon, given Israel's own capacity, makes Iran much more vulnerable. Where do you go? Where's the strategic logic for Iran? Or is this all about just projecting sort of bravado and regional influence, as opposed to a serious desire to create a program that would have the capacity to really deter Israel or have a first strike capacity, for example? So those are all sort of issues that I thought we might touch on, and then there are other questions, of course, we can go to. Barbara, perhaps you want to jump in there, and then Assal, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Let me start. I mean, a lot of Iran's program comes from inertia. We have to remember that the United States started this program under the Shah back in the 1950s. We were actually poised to sell the Shah 8 nuclear reactors during the 1970s. We provided Iran's only research reactor in the late 1960s. And Iran stopped the program after the revolution, primarily because all the Western suppliers pulled out. And then it revived it because of fear of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War and fear that Saddam Hussein, who was already using chemical weapons against Iran, would use nuclear weapons against Iran. But then we have this long period again where it very slowly advances. And so, if Iran really needed nuclear weapons, it would have gotten them a long time ago. I think this is inertia. I think this is about prestige. I think it's about looking like an advanced industrial nation, and that Iran and Iranians have paid a huge price in terms of sanctions and hostility from others for a program that, even after all these years, they have one functioning civilian nuclear power plant, which was a German installation that the Russians finally completed after many, many years, a decade ago. So I think it's been a colossal waste. That's my view. But there's the sunken costs now are so high that how do you walk away? That's, I think, the problem for the Iranian government. It's just not possible for them to walk away. And the more, especially the Israelis, jump up and down and scream about it, even harder for Iran to walk away when Israel has at least 90 nuclear warheads and that are not declared, never inspected, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think there is a debate, as Assal said, that Iran should just quit the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and go for a bomb. But I don't think they could get there. Their program is so penetrated by Israeli intelligence and Western intelligence. Remember that the Israelis stole out from under Iran's nose from a warehouse in Tehran a lot of documents that had to do with their previous weaponization program that ended in 2003. And the Israelis seem to have an uncanny ability to hit various installations. They've killed more than half a dozen Iranian nuclear scientists and engineers. So I don't think Iran would get to that point. I don't think we even need to talk about an Israeli attack, a massive attack with bunker busting bombs. I think the Israelis will continue to pick at the program and nip at it in such ways that it will never quite get there. And Iranian officials are probably recognize that and understand that. But again, the problem is, how do you move gracefully away? And that's why the JCPOA, I think, still has appeal, because they've already developed so much more knowledge since the U.S. pulled out. They can do a lot more with this program, certainly on the civilian side, if they have cooperation from the international community, which they would get if they go back into the JCPOA. They would get more nuclear power plants that they could actually use for their own energy shortages, and a variety of cooperation in terms of nuclear safety and so on. So, I think we still have to push for them to see it in those terms.
Yeah, thank you very much. Years ago, I co-authored a piece for the Baker Institute, in which we looked at the Iranian National Oil Company, and one of the things that was clear, among other things, of how inefficient it is, and there was nothing new there, but the Iranian energy needs will not be satisfied by a nuclear program at all. We know where the Iranian energy needs will be satisfied, that's through oil and gas. So the strategic purpose of a program is not clear. On the other hand, it seems that Iran's leaders cannot resist every once in a while sort of making statements about Israel that only reinforce the perception in Israel that the actual purpose is to aim those weapons, or aim a weapon at Israel. So that, despite the fact that there are certainly people in the Israeli security community who feel like getting out of the agreement was a mistake. There's huge consensus in the security community about the perception that Iran represents a real, perhaps existential threat, even if, strangely enough, perhaps it doesn't. So it's a very curious situation that goes to sort of I want to sort of reiterate the question that I put out before. Maybe Assal, you can help us, and that is, do Iranian hardliners at the end of the day, are they willing to have any kind of agreement when, in fact, at the end of the day, their own ideological legitimacy thrives and depends on and requires sustaining conflict of some kind with the United States? Are we dealing with a regime that's really capable of particularly in light, of course, all the things you've mentioned about the American withdrawal from the agreement under Trump and so on. But putting that aside, and that's a big aside, what about sort of the nature of the regime? Is this a regime that can strike a deal or not at the end?
I think precedent says they can, right? Because we know that they have. So that would be the sort of direct answer is, of course they can, because we've seen that they have. One thing, to keep in mind when we're talking about, because I think the original point of the question was, why is there so much concern? And a lot of it is political. It's a politicized concern, right? The concern isn't that the idea that Iran is a threat to the United States is absurd on its face. I'm just going to say that. It's not really a threat to the United States, but the fact that it is a perceived threat, as you said, Daniel, it's a perceived threat to Israel, politicizes this question. And oftentimes, if you look back at May 2021, there's a press conference with Antony Blinken and Benjamin Netanyahu, and the subject is supposed to be the bombardment of Gaza. What does Netanyahu do? Immediately pivot to Iran, right? So Iran is used oftentimes by Israel as this sort of boogeyman, as this existential threat, which is very arguable. I mean, you have British-Israeli historian Avi Shlaim talking about the fact that the existential threat is actually in reverse. It's Israel that's an existential threat to Iran and not the other way around. So there's all sorts of ways of discussing why is it such a concern? It's a concern because we have made it a concern, and that is in part politicized. Now, on the Iranian side, what did I say earlier? I said Iranians themselves, not the state, not the officials, but Iranians themselves, according to polls, largely support the nuclear program. Why? Because it's a point of national independence. You cannot remove the sort of history of Western imposition into the region, colonialism, from the views that people have of the types of pressure that they're still put on them. So even if it doesn't have the type of strategic results that we're thinking, like, what is the logic? The logic is from the point of view of those people that they should have the independence to do it. Iran is a signatory to the NPT. It's allowed to have a civilian program. And the fact that everybody knows that Israel has nuclear weapons and no one acknowledges it, and the US doesn't acknowledge it, and it's just, there's no IAEA inspections in Israel. None of these things occurred. That double standard plays into that politicization, and it plays into the sentiments of those people. And I think oftentimes in these conversations, we tend to frame these questions as just officials talking about things, whereas the psychology of the individual who's experiencing it, coming from especially, decades, centuries of colonial trauma, comes from the fact that they want independence. They want to believe that they are an independent state, that they don't have to submit to pressure. And that is sort of the problem with the way that the US has approached the deal under the, it's literally it was called maximum pressure. So it was a pressure only tactic. And what we saw worked was when there was actually a diplomatic effort, and that worked to curb any kind of weaponization that Iran would want to pursue. That's what the JCPOA made sure to cap, but still allowing them to have that civilian nuclear program, allowing them to have, and something to keep in mind is nuclear research isn't just about energy and weaponization either, right? We talk about energy and weaponization as the two main things, but it has other applications as well. So the fact that they want to maintain that independence and be able to do that research is sort of a basic component of sovereignty of any state.
Thank you very much. I've got a question here that I think has been raised a number of times, and that is, if there was a deal that removed nuclear-related sanctions, Iran would be able to start pumping more oil. And the question is basically, why wouldn't Biden want to see that happen and reap the domestic benefits of getting more Iranian oil on the international market? It's certainly an interesting question, but of course, the Biden administration's concerns are not necessarily reducible to those concerns. But anybody who wants to jump in on this, I'd welcome. We have two versions of this question, I think, already set out.
Maybe I'll just quickly say a few words, and others can jump in as well. I mean, I think clearly Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia has been not necessarily followed through by actions that the administration would have wanted to have seen. We've seen a number of very concerning sentencing of young Saudi women to decades-long imprisonment for social media activities. We've also seen OPEC Plus under de facto Saudi sort of leadership with Prince Abdulaziz, OPEC Plus making a very small increase in production for September only, and then making it very clear that was a one-off, and so cutting production. And so you can only wonder if OPEC Plus is beginning to think about the possibility of an Iranian return to the markets, and really trying to perhaps manage that in a way that they can perhaps preserve a degree of pricing that they feel comfortable with. So again, I think it's about regional states thinking about their own interests, just because they're putting their interests over and above those of their US partner, which, again, just going back to what someone else said, was kind of lack of reliability, that sort of sense that they don't know where the US is going to go next. And so I think there maybe is a more muscular, assertive interest in doing what's best for OPEC Plus, and perhaps doing what's best in terms of thinking ahead and how a return of Iranian oil might impact those markets. And of course, Biden will be looking at it in terms of US interests, but that's not necessarily the calculus in Gulf capitals at all.
Indeed, and Biden did not get what he had perhaps hoped for as a result of this trip. It does sort of raise a bigger issue, and that is, and Kristian, you maybe could address these as well, but everybody else could jump in, and that is just to unpack a little bit more about sort of if you look at the United Arab Emirates, their leaders are extremely adept at walking this fine line. I mean, this is nothing new, but right now the number of lines that they're walking, it seems to me, is quite remarkable, and I suppose almost somewhat successfully, at least in the short term. But the longer term implications, or even the medium term implications of a foreign policy that's based on the one hand on essentially trying to reach out to Iran and reestablish relations, and the negotiations on all of that, which is an initiative that comes from within the region for obviously regional considerations. On the other hand, bandwagoning on the Abraham Accords and the evolving structure in the region, which has its own logic and could take. So if you're worried about sort of your own security, and you're at the same time part of a kind of evolving regional order that involves in a major way Israel as a key facet of that now, and every day we read more reports about the evolving technological security relationships between Arab Gulf countries, particularly UAE and Israel. So, where does this take the leaders of the UAE and other Arab Gulf states when they're sort of trying to have their cake and eat it too, which is reach out, establish a rapprochement with Iran, ease regional relations. Of course, the United Arab Emirates are still worried about the drone attacks on their own facilities and the effect of the Yemen situation there. So, how long is that a kind of sustainable calculation, and where does that all fit into their perceptions of an agreement on the nuclear issue? Big question, but I think it's worth.
I think that's right. And I mean, I think the attacks on Abu Dhabi at the beginning of this year that were sort of traced to Yemen were an indication that the UAE can no longer pursue a cost-free set of regional policies. In a sense, in 2015, they were big parts of the coalition that intervened in Yemen. Up until 2016, you had UAE forces very much on the front line, pushing the Houthis back from parts of southern Yemen, without facing the same blowback. And I think this is a message now that if you reinsert UAE-backed forces, as they were, onto the Houthi frontline, this time there will be consequences, and that they do have the capability as well as the intent to strike. And I think that really brought home to the UAE perhaps that this strategic calculus has shifted since 2015, and that they are faced in a much more volatile, risky situation where they do have to recalibrate to some extent. And we've seen that. And as you say, I think there is going to be a lot of very tight balancing going on. I also think that perceptions are very strong, and the perceptions in Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are very much that after 3 successive US administrations, they all think that they're not entirely sure what's going to happen next. And the sense of US disengagement, at least, if not physical disengagement, at least a sense that they are disengaging in some capacity, I think is very strong. Certainly, I think the Abraham Accord between the UAE and Israel was about those two countries beginning to think about a post-American Gulf in terms of which countries step up if they see the US stepping back, regardless of whether that happens or not. And certainly that's how I read the strategic component of the US, of the Abraham Accord, with a strategic agenda for the Middle East. I read that as UAE and Israel beginning to think about stepping up in closer collaboration, just thinking ahead. And of course, we await to see how exactly that takes, what form that takes. We await to see whether over time there will be a formalization of links, perhaps including other Gulf countries, including, of course, Saudi Arabia potentially. But I think that they're all looking at ways in which trying to perhaps avoid a security vacuum if they perceive the US to be disengaging, and to think who can fill that vacuum. And of course, Israel and the UAE, I think, are both thinking that they'll be the ones. Now, we have seen snags in that. Of course, the F-35 deal, which many saw at the time in 2020 as being the cornerstone of sort of normalization, one of the sort of prizes of normalizing. We've seen that now, I think, being effectively abandoned, partly because of the UAE's relationship with China. So we are seeing that perhaps it's more difficult to balance in reality than it is perhaps on paper. But certainly, I think we're going to see a lot of balancing in the next couple of years, especially as they watch events play out in the US over the next 2 years as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. A good friend of mine from the UAE who was in town a few months ago talked about being under attack and the drone strikes and so on. And she said something which was remarkable to me, because she's not exactly a friend of Israel. She said, I sort of know how the Israelis feel right now, and that sense of vulnerability. And I just thought, wow, that's an interesting, it's anecdotal, but that's an interesting remark from somebody who's living in the heart of this and gets a sense of the proximity of that kind of threat and what that means in their daily lives. And it's something, those subjective feelings are very important. It still raises, for me, and as we push the discussion just a little bit further, I'm still trying to figure out, and I see this also reflected in some of our questions, what this implies if the regional evolution of security, particularly between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, for the capacity of Israel to deter Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Because you can see that these relationships might affect and respond to what Iranian behavior, so-called, in the region, and Iraq, Syria, and the rest of it. It might provide some deterrent power and so on in the Gulf. But at the end of the day, and if the U.S. is not willing to confront Iran militarily and use the kinds of munitions that would be necessary for really doing major damage to Iran's nuclear facilities, and they're not willing to give Israel the munitions, as it appears so far, to do the job, where this all leaves, is there a strategic coherence to a policy that has, perhaps in one arena makes sense, but in the other doesn't necessarily have any capacity to limit Iran's nuclear program absent an agreement? So I'm just trying to understand sort of where I don't think the Israelis can manage the job without the kinds of support from the United States required to undertake the kind of attack. And I'm not saying that based on my experience or my knowledge, but of other experts, American, Israeli, and so on. So, where's the coherence in a U.S. policy that is backing the Abraham Accords and may have valid reasons to do so, but doesn't necessarily tie into a meaningful way of preventing Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapons program? Anybody who wants to sort of contribute to answering that question would help me try to figure this out as well. Yes, Barbara.
Yeah, look, there is no military solution to the Iranian nuclear program, and everybody knows it. They know too much. They've gone too far. And a massive attack would just incentivize them to actually develop nuclear weapons. So a lot of this, I think, is for domestic political consumption, particularly in Israel. But it's kind of meaningless. And that's why you do see, I think, other kinds of cooperation now developing between Israel and Arab states. I was just listening, actually, before I came on this, to an event at the Atlantic Council on the Abraham Accords. And, these countries are talking about economic cooperation, investment, tourism, all these other ways in which they can improve and integrate their economies and build relationships among their peoples. And the Abraham Accords, it's one of the few good things that came out of the Trump administration. I think it was a good step, and my hope is that at some point, Iran will look at this and say, why are we the only Muslims in the world defending the Palestinians? Why are we more Arab than the Arabs? What has this gained us? But again, inertia. Domestic political inertia is such that countries that are used to having certain enemies continue to have those enemies, and it's easier than trying to find a way through it. So it's death to Israel and the Israelis continuing to attack and sabotage Iran ad infinitum. But, we've seen major changes. We have Israel is now part of CENTCOM, as Kristian mentioned. And so we do have coordination by the United States of some of the military activities, defensive activities of the Arab countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf and Israel. And that's an important step. It's something I think the Iranians have to be concerned about. I don't think anything is really going to upset this. The question is whether somehow the Palestinians can be satisfied in terms of this process and given their rights at long last. But Iran is really, I think, on the losing side of this question now.
Yeah, I mean, Iran and certainly the Palestinians have legitimate concerns that all of this is simply at their expense and undermining their leverage. We can get into another discussion about that, but this is all transpiring without any hope for any kind of progress on that issue. And to my mind, that's an unfortunate outcome. But I have one more question, then we're going to have to wrap it up. And this, by the way, one of the questions is what happens if Bibi gets reelected? You never count him out, right? That could sort of accentuate some of these tensions even more. I think that's a possibility, but we'll see with that. But I am wondering, again, and Assal, you can, anybody can comment on this, but when we see the world evolving as it is, and we see the region, the Middle East evolving as it is, and Barbara says Iran is on the losing edge or side of this process, what does Iran, as the leaders, gain from a policy resistance that basically requires or doesn't, or can they pursue an economic policy resistance that is economically successful and viable, and do so without an agreement? I mean, is this a strategy that holds out the possibility of real success? I mean, this is a major issue if there is no agreement, obviously, but it has longer term consequences.
Well, I mean, going back to the previous question and what Barbara was talking about as well, I think all of this makes a case for the agreement, right? And it's mutual. And I wouldn't frame it as either a benefit to Iran or a benefit to the U.S. or it's a benefit to everyone, and that's the reality, and that's why it has significant international support. It's why it's been held on a lifeline for so many years by the international community, because everyone knows it is beneficial across the board. It's by its very nature beneficial, right? Like sometimes I think when we talk about the deal, we forget what the deal is. It's a non-proliferation agreement. That benefits everybody. It doesn't just benefit Iran because of its economic, because of the economic benefits. I mean, when you talk about the Iranian state, when you talk about officials in Iran, and Barbara said this earlier, and it's true, they don't care about what happens to the populace. They care about surviving themselves. And I would expand that and say that's true of basically most states in the world, right? That every state is looking for their own self-interest and their own survival, and that's what they're doing as well. And the more pressure there is on them, so when we talk about resistance, the more pressure you put on them, the more they'll resist it. I mean, this is like a sort of natural way that things happen. So what becomes the alternative? We know military options don't work. I mean, we just know that they don't work. Look at the last 20 years. You have 20 years of war in Afghanistan. The Taliban took over in days. So the idea that we can militarily solve these problems has been proven over and over again not to work. We've shown that we know that with the 2015 deal, diplomacy does work. So that's the answer. I mean, we're sort of full circle in this conversation. The answer is the deal. That's how you prevent all these things from happening. And one thing I wanted to mention when we talk about the Abraham Accords is the problem with the Abraham Accords is they say nothing about Palestinians. Right? You can't have a peace agreement if there's nothing to do with Palestinians. If you're talking about Israel, you talk about peace without talking about Palestinians, that's not really what the Accords are about. But also, when you talk about the Abraham Accords, it's more about this strategy of creating a region that's against Iran. That won't work in the long run. Iran is not going anywhere. Iran is a gigantic country in the region, has a massive population. It has a well-entrenched government, whether or not anybody likes it, it is there. And so it has to be dealt with. Now it just becomes a question of how. And the thing is, we have the answer. We have the best answer. And it's just a question of the political will to implement it again.
Yes, the political will. That's a major issue. Well, there's so much more to discuss here today, but I think we have to wrap things up. So thanks to all our magnificent panelists for this discussion. I'm sure that we'll be taking up these issues again, and the hopes for an agreement will be rise and fall probably 10 times between now and 6 p.m. this evening. We'll see what happens. But thanks all of you for joining us, and thanks to the Arab Center for hosting this discussion as well.